law enforcement measures across the territory. I want to cross back down to Canberra now and catch up with Liberal Senator James Paterson. Thanks for joining us, James.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
First up, the National Farmers Federation calling for farmer exit payments, people getting out of the drought by selling up and getting off the land. Why would the government get involved in this? Surely if someone decides to leave the land, they sell their farm, take their profits or their losses and move on.
Chris, I think the government will and should consider all the ideas put forward by the National Farmers Federation because this drought is a very serious problem facing our country, and it is one that hasn't gone away and isn't going away anytime soon. So all good ideas I think will be well heard and considered here in Canberra. Whether we adopt any of those ideas is a different matter. It'll have to go through the normal government processes and withstand the scrutiny of the government's consideration. And I'm not sure that we will be going down that path, but I think it'll certainly get a fair hearing here in Canberra.
Perhaps more practical in terms of people who want to leave the land might be some sort of training or resettlement assistance so that people can either upskill or move into another job in the cities or in regional towns.
That's right, Chris. In fact, the government has lots of programs in this area, in the skills area, where we do look to retrain people who, for any reason, need to change employment. Whether they can be better tailored to target people who might be leaving the land, I think is a really good suggestion and something I'm sure we'll turn our minds to.
Tell me about this revelation today through the Daily Telegraph that a childcare centre in Sydney's North Shore is using 3-, 4- and 5-year-old kids to go out and rustle up petition signatures to try and make sure the Aboriginal flag is flying every day on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Do you believe that these children are being co-opted in a political cause?
I do, and I think it's inappropriate, Chris, and it doesn't really matter what the content of the political cause is, whether it was something that I was sympathetic to or something I disagreed with. Can we just let 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds enjoy their childhood and enjoy their time in childcare and not be used as props for the political campaigns that clearly their carers would like to run? I think that it's really, frankly, way out of line.
There's not a childcare centre in the country that doesn't have the hand of government there in the till. It's all funded by government payments and subsidies primarily. Surely the government therefore can make sure we get this political interference out of childcare centres. Bad enough the issues we're dealing with in our schools with some political issues, but 3-, 4- and 5-year-olds running political campaigns, surely it's up to the government to stop this as a condition of its funding.
Honestly, Chris, I would hope that that was not necessary. I would hope that childcare centre operators have the good sense and judgment to realise
obviously not.
Yes, because they're taxpayer funded, but also
sorry to interrupt Senator James Paterson, but obviously that's not the case because we have a childcare centre here using its kids to run a political campaign.
Yeah, you're right, Chris. At least in the case of this childcare centre, and I hope no others, there is clearly been a failure of judgment and a failure here. And I hope that now this has come to light, they reflect on the appropriateness of this. I imagine if I was a parent of a child in that childcare centre, I'd have a few strong words to share with the management of that childcare centre and be asking for an explanation as to why they thought this was appropriate. Whether in fact they informed parents about this or not, I think they're really big questions for the childcare centre to answer.
Okay, from the micro-politics of what goes on in the childcare centre to the macro-politics of our strategic engagement, and a bunch of federal MPs will be off to China on a delegation. These sort of exchanges happen all the time. Seems to be a bit of a focus on the fact that Andrew Hastie is going because he's made some robust criticisms of the Chinese communist regime. Surely Andrew Hastie is exactly the sort of politician we want to go to China and to engage with the Chinese.
That's right, Chris. Andrew and I are both going on this trip together later this year. Both he and I have had a bit to say about our profound concerns about human rights abuses from the Chinese Communist Party, whether that relates to Dr Yang, the Australian writer who's detained there at the moment, whether it relates to the situation in Hong Kong, whether it relates to the Uyghur people in Xinjiang province. We've been outspoken on these issues, and this will be a really good opportunity for us not just to learn more about China and the Chinese people and to talk to them directly about that, but also for us to put on the record and raise directly the concerns that we have about the Chinese Communist Party's approach to these issues.
Well, good on you. As you say, you've been outspoken as well because you always stand up for liberty and freedom and democracy. We've had Labor politicians go there recently, someone as senior as Richard Marles, and he didn't raise with the Chinese the case of the Australian detained at the moment. What level do you expect to be able to raise some of these issues? And tell us about the way you interact here, because presumably you're all in favour of close engagement with China. It just needs to be realistic about our differing systems and values.
That's right, Chris. I mean, every Australian understands the importance of China to our economy, and every Australian, including the Australian government, really values that relationship. It's a very important two-way relationship. But I was very disappointed that when Richard Marles went to China on a trip like the one that Andrew Hastie and I will be going on, when he was apparently wined and dined by senior Chinese Communist Party officials, that he didn't use the opportunity to raise the plight of an Australian citizen, his fellow Australian, who is currently being detained on spurious charges and is being accused of things that the Australian government is not convinced there's any evidence of. That he didn't raise that, I think, is really disappointing, and that he also chose to use that trip to deliver a speech to say that we needed to increase our military cooperation with Beijing, I think sent all the wrong signals about whether the Labor Party is willing to stand up for Australia's interests and Australia's values in our relationship with China. I can say that on this upcoming trip we won't make that mistake.
Yeah, speaking about sending the right signals, will you say to your Chinese interlocutors that China should stop trying to interfere in our political processes? That is, signing up politicians to propaganda organisations, making large cash donations to political parties, paying the private bills of politicians. Are you going to warn them to back off and that they seem to have corrupted our political system, at least to some degree?
Chris, I'm sure those matters will be discussed, but actually I think on that issue the burden is on us to stand up for ourselves and to do that within our own political system. And the legislative changes that we've made, I think, are very welcome. We've banned foreign donations. We've established a foreign influence register. We are taking a much more robust and sceptical approach to all foreign interference in Australian elections and democracy, as we should.
Hang on a second. Your own Liberal colleague Gladys Liu has been caught giving incorrect information about her links to Chinese propaganda organisations. And of course we have the unfolding saga of the $100,000 Audi bag and the chaos that's caused in New South Wales Labor. Obviously this is an ongoing problem.
Well, most of those events, Chris, are historical and they predate the change in the law. That doesn't change in any way the seriousness of them. I agree. There have been lapses of judgment across the Australian political system in our engagement with foreign actors, most spectacularly in the case of China, and particularly the now banned individual Wang Zhengmo, they are mistakes that we have all learned from. And I think, frankly, a few years ago, the Australian political class was really naive about the risks that foreign interference poses in our political system. Thankfully, we've woken up to those risks, and I think we have a much more robust system in place now to guard against those.
Let's hope so, but be careful what you say on the phone while you're there.
Thanks, Chris.